Welcome to the Script Page channel. Today, we're diving headfirst into a real scientific mystery about the inner workings of the animal brain. We're going to explore some foundational, truly fascinating experiments that forever changed how we view the creatures we share this planet with. I mean, have you ever looked at a tiny creature scuttling across a pond and wondered, hey, is there anyone actually home in there? Well, in today's Explainer, we're going on a journey to find out exactly that.
So for a really long time, scientists assumed that creatures like crawfish or frogs were, well, basically just automated reflex machines. Historically, science viewed them as entirely incapable of profiting from their own experiences. The assumption was that if you put them in a new situation, they'd just react, mechanistically, without ever actually learning a single thing. But is that actually true?
Let's start by digging into Section 1. Are animals just robots?
To really get this, we gotta look at the baseline, the widely accepted myth that these animals were essentially just biological clockwork. The old belief, which we'll call the reflex machine myth, was that without complex, highly developed brains, these creatures just blindly reacted to their environment. People thought they never formed memories, never adapted, and absolutely never learned to avoid a repetitive danger. It was thought that if a predator was hiding in a dark corner, the animal would just hide in that same dark corner again and again, guided only by rigid instinct, completely blind to the consequences.
Moving right along to Section 2, Escaping the Labyrinth. To test this whole robot theory properly, researchers designed a brilliant experiment. They placed a crawfish in a simple labyrinth with a blocked exit, just to see if the animal could eventually learn the correct, open path back to the safety of the water. Now, think about the number 100 for a second. That is the average number of times it takes for a crawfish to perfectly memorize that open path. At first, they wander, they make mistakes, they hit dead ends, but bit by bit, the mistakes decrease. Sure, it takes time, around 100 repetitions, but the learning absolutely, definitively happens.
And through this exact step-by-step process, the crawfish proved it wasn't just some mindless robot. It started with pure trial and error. Then it began memorizing the correct turn, showing a really clear preference for the open path. And finally, it pulled off a flawless escape, making zero mistakes. The animal was actively profiting from its experience to survive. It was literally updating its own internal software.
Which brings us to Section 3, the senses of habit. Now the big question is, how exactly are these tiny creatures mapping out this labyrinth in their minds? If they're learning, what tools are they using to build these life-saving habits? Well, it turns out they rely on 4 distinct sensory factors. They don't just use one trick. They use vision to see light and shadow. They use touch to feel the walls. They use a chemical sense to smell and taste the water. But honestly, the most fascinating piece of the puzzle is that 4th one, muscle memory. The sheer physical sensation of turning in a specific direction becomes deeply, deeply wired right into their nervous system.
In fact, that muscle memory is so incredibly strong that if you change the rules on them, like if you block the path they've memorized and open the other one, they experience total confusion. They rely so heavily on that ingrained physical habit that they will stubbornly try to push right through solid glass walls. They try to execute the exact physical turn their muscles remember, completely ignoring what their own eyes are telling them. It's a pretty powerful reminder of just how unbreakable physical habits can become.
Let's dive into Section 4, Fear Paralyzes the Mind.
Okay, let's switch gears and look at the green frog, because this perfectly builds our understanding of how fear messes with cognition. Frogs can also learn simple labyrinths, but researchers noticed a really fascinating psychological twist. There's a stark contrast here. When a frog is relaxed, it can slowly form associations, figure out a maze, and learn the path to the water. But the very second you introduce a frightening stimulus, like poking it with a stick or making a sudden jerky movement, its brain essentially locks down. A frightened frog abandons all attempts to solve the puzzle and just falls back entirely on hardwired survival instincts.
This brings us to a really cool phenomenon known as instinctive inhibition. Basically, it's a survival reflex where fear completely paralyzes the ability to process new information. And honestly, this translates to a timeless, universal concept for us too. Fear absolutely blocks the brain's ability to learn and adapt to new situations. You simply cannot teach a terrified mind, whether it belongs to a tiny amphibian or a human being.
As the early scientific observers of this pointed out, fright basically just serves to confuse the animal, completely preventing it from responding normally. So, instead of figuring out the puzzle, a scared frog will press its head tight to the ground, puff up its body to look bigger, and just wait for a visual cue to jump. It entirely throws logic and memory out the window in favor of pure, defensive programming. And their survival habits in the wild? They are rigid, sure, but they're absolutely brilliant. For instance, they will completely ignore general, harmless background noise. You can make loud sounds and they don't care. But they will instantly tune into the highly specific warning sound of another frog splashing into water. That one single sound puts them on high alert. When threatened, they crouch down and puff up. And strangely enough, even though they hear the warning, they rely almost entirely on actually seeing a threat before they'll make that leap.
Finally, Section 5, the speed of survival.
To truly understand what's going on in their heads, researchers actually measured their speed of thought to see how fast a habit or instinct fires when danger strikes. When charting their reaction times to different levels of physical stimulation, we see 3 distinct tiers. There's a lightning-fast 50 milliseconds, a middle tier at 150 milliseconds, and a much slower tier at 300 milliseconds and above. Each of these represents a completely different neurological pathway being hijacked by the animal, all depending on how severe the situation is.
Let's break those down. First up, the spinal reflex. When faced with severe, painful danger, the spinal cord just takes over. It triggers a jump in 50 milliseconds. To put that into perspective for you, that is blindingly fast. The signal literally bypasses the brain entirely. It saves their life before the frog even consciously knows what just happened. Now, if the threat is moderate, startling but not immediately painful, the signal actually has time to reach the primary centers of the brain. This results in an instinctive reaction, which takes about 150 milliseconds. It's a slightly slower, instinctual leap away from danger. There's no hesitation here, just a quick, deeply programmed response.
But here is where it gets really interesting. If the stimulus is super weak or just familiar, the animal actually takes its time. A reaction taking 300 milliseconds or even a full second proves they are actively evaluating the situation before choosing to act. They aren't just reacting blindly. They are weighing whether the effort of moving is actually worth it.
So what we're looking at is the literal evolution of a habit. When an animal is first exposed to something brand new, it reacts with an instant reflex to a perceived danger. But with repeated exposure, they build familiarity. They realize, oh, this stimulus isn't deadly. And slowly, that lightning-fast panic response transforms into a relaxed, deliberate choice. It's the physiological shift from a terrified instinct to a learned calm habit.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want you to think about your own life for a second. We've seen how crawfish stubbornly rely on muscle memory, and how fear literally shuts down a frog's ability to learn. So when does fear paralyze your own learning? And when do your deeply ingrained habits run on pure autopilot, causing you to push against a metaphorical glass wall? The foundations of our minds are built on the exact same evolutionary bedrock as these creatures. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next one.